Welcome to Learn Jazz Drums. Today's topic is something that was requested, and the topic is what not to do to keep that jazz sound. So this person is clearly referencing the fact that jazz drummers often sound a lot different from other drummers in regards to touch and feel and volume and everything on the drums. So maybe if you're playing a different style of music for a while and you come back and play jazz, what should you keep in mind? Without constantly keeping up on all the intricacies of jazz drumming, it can be very easy to lose some of that stuff. You can check out my full article about the differences between jazz and pop drumming in the description below, but first, here are my top 5 things not to do to keep that jazz sound. Number 1, don't play the drums too loud. So in pop music and many other styles of music, the bass drum and the snare drum are the priority of the groove. And that's compared to jazz drumming where the ride cymbal and the hi-hat is the priority. So you don't want to sound like this. You want to sound more like this. So notice how the balance on the kit is completely different than it would be in pop drumming. The ride cymbal and the hi-hat are most prominent, and then my feathering on the bass drum can barely be heard. If you're listening to this on a phone speaker, you probably didn't hear it at all, and that's great. That's what it should be. And then the comping sits below the ride cymbal and the hi-hat, and it creates this nice groove. And this goes both ways too. You don't want to be a jazz drummer that's playing pop, but doing it with this same balance that you would be playing jazz. It's got to be different for pop. Here's what you don't want to sound like. Terrible, right? You want to sound more like this. So whatever style of music you're playing, make sure that you keep your limbs in balance for what is appropriate to that style. So if you're playing jazz, ride cymbal priority. Number 2 is don't play too many rim shots, like so. So a well-placed rim shot can go a long way, but what I just did was way too many rim shots. That should never happen in jazz, and definitely don't do that. Now I'll do some normal comping, and I'll throw in some rim shots so you can see where a well-placed rim shot can fit in. So that's number 2. Pretty simple, but I see a lot of people doing this. They play a lot of rim shots, and especially if people are playing matched grip, they're really tempted to play those rim shots where you're kind of digging it in. And it just doesn't sound right. You should be playing normal snare drum notes for the majority of your comping. Number 3 is don't comp too much. So oftentimes when we play music that's a lot less spontaneous or it's a lot less improvised in that moment, we go over to play jazz and we're kind of like, oh yeah, I have to play spontaneous, I have to improvise, I have to do all this stuff. But keep in mind, the ride cymbal and the groove are the main priorities. And of course, improvisation is super important, but make sure that you don't overplay in an attempt to sound jazzy. So let's say someone's counting off a standard and it's with a singer and it's not supposed to be super involved. It's supposed to just swing. Here's how not to do it. And just for example, I'll do everything that I've already mentioned as being a no-go. So I'll do rim shots on the snare drum, I'll comp too much, I'll play the bass drum and the snare drum too loud, just so you can see how overplaying and all of these things go hand in hand, and you should make sure not to do them. First of all, what I just demonstrated is very out of balance, and that's the main thing. But that vocabulary could possibly work in some musical situation if it's calling for it, but most likely that's going to be too much and you're going to be overplaying. All right, number 4 is don't play comping that sounds like a backbeat groove. So a lot of times if you're playing a lot of backbeat oriented music, it can be kind of hard to ditch this because it's such a vital part. In most backbeat music, if you miss a single backbeat, it's like the floor dropped out from underneath you. Everything is ruined for that moment. So it can be a little difficult to ditch this for jazz and just rely on the quarter note, but that's what it is. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Right there, that's the basis of the groove, and you don't need some backbeat to hold it down. And this might sound really obvious, but sometimes it's just hard to ditch it, and I'll give you an example. So notice how that kind of sounds like I'm comping, but at the same time it kind of sounds like a backbeat? Just make sure you don't do that. Make sure that you comp normally, and you don't have to play a backbeat. It doesn't have to have this kind of halftime feel going on. The quarter note pulse is what's most important. And lastly, number 5 is don't crash too much. So in other styles of music, it's common to crash on beat 1 of every 16, 12, 8, or 4 bars. And in jazz, it's pretty rare, especially for 4 bars, that you're going to hear a crash on every single beat 1. And then also every 8 bars. It's very unlikely that you're going to hear a full crash every 8 bars because that really locks in the overall feel. And usually a song is about 32 bars long, and this instrumentalist, whoever it is soloing, is going to be telling a story over the course of those 32 bars. So if you're playing and locking them in every 8 bars to a beat 1 so that the phrases end up only feeling like 8 bars as opposed to this long 32 bar story that then keeps going for multiple choruses, it's not very fun and it really is going to lock in the instrumentalists. Here's what not to do, and I'll crash every 4 bars on beat 1 just to really get the point across. 1, 2, 3. So first off, playing on beat 1 every 4 bars gridlocks the groove by itself. But second of all, just playing a big crash as opposed to an accent is not really stylistically accurate. So I'll give you an example. I'll do the same thing every 4 bars, but I'm just going to accent on beat 1 as opposed to playing a full crash. And you'll probably notice that it somehow works better. I want to... Still too locked in my opinion, to a 4-bar phrase, but it sounds a little less forceful because it's not a full-on crash like you would play in other types of music. It's just an accent. Now I'll go ahead and play a destination point every 8 bars. So it's not that I'm going to crash every 8 bars, it's a destination, a landing point every 8 bars. So it could be on beat 1, on the and of 4, on 4. It's all going to depend on the comping that I'm playing. And since I'm by myself, it's really just going to depend on my comping and what is going on in my head. But in a musical scenario, you're going to base this all off of what's going on around you, what the other players are playing. So that was much better, right? The music had a chance to breathe, and the players have an opportunity to create over that space. Maybe play something over the bar line. They don't feel locked into an 8-bar form. If I look back, I think I did the first crash on 1, then I did the and of 4, then I did 4, then I did 1, and then I think I ended on the and of 4. So it's all based on what is going on in the moment, and that was just based on the comping that I was creating. And it's all going to be based on the other instrumentalists and what's going on in the moment. But overall, just make sure you're not crashing every 4 or 8 bars and not always doing it the same beat. Always doing it on beat 1 locks it in, even always doing it on the end of 4 locks it in too much. Now keep in mind, most musicians are going to really appreciate a very clearly marked form from the drummer, but you don't want to overdo it like I was doing before. You can be clear, you can play and of 4, you can do whatever is calling for at the moment, and listen to a lot of jazz to figure that stuff out. But you don't want to overdo it so that it's really locked in and it's just like, here's the top, here's 4 bars, here's 8 bars. You don't want to play it like that. So that's my 5 things not to do to get that jazz sound. So first off, it's don't play the drums too loud. Make sure that you keep in mind in jazz, the ride cymbal and the hi-hat are the priority and everything else fits below it. Number 2, don't play too many rim shots. In jazz, that's not stylistically the way it goes. You play normal snare drum notes, and rim shots are like the occasional special treat. Number 3, don't comp too much. So you don't want to be too busy because you're all of a sudden playing jazz and you feel like you need to improvise. It's all based on groove still. It just has a little more going on. So don't overplay. Number 4 was don't play comping that sounds like a backbeat groove. So make sure that your comping sounds natural and it doesn't feel locked into some weird halftime groove or anything. And then number 5 is don't crash too much. So this is referring to the actual action of crashing the cymbal. You can do a lot of other things, you can accent with them, but overall there's a lot less actual crashing happening in jazz as compared to other styles of music. And then it's also referring to not locking in the form. You don't want to go every 4 bars and play a big crash on beat 1, or even every 8 bars. You don't want to lock it in. You want it to be this fluid groove that people can play over and they feel comfortable and they feel like it flows. So keep that in mind when you're playing jazz, and especially when you're switching from other styles over to jazz. And I hope these tips were helpful. Make sure you subscribe to this channel, the Learn Jazz Drums channel. I come out with a new video lesson every single week. And thanks so much for watching. I'll see you on the next video.